First of all, I am very glad and delighted to welcome our new participants, and the first speaker is, without any exaggeration, an extraordinary scholar with wonderful publications, and I can hardly find any specialist in the Asia-Pacific studies who doesn't know his name. This is Mark Beeson, our friend from Australia. And before I give the floor to Mark, one preliminary remark. His Excellency wanted to make a presentation on Russia-Indonesia relationship between two mega projects, the Indo-Pacific region and the Greater Eurasia, and he will be speaking after Professor Masakov. But now, my colleagues, let me give the floor to Mark Beeson. Mark, the floor is yours. Nice to see you here again, and we are ready to listen to you.
Yeah, I think it's unmuted. Can you hear me?
Well, I can hear you. Now it's okay.
Okay. So just saying that thank you very much again for inviting me again, Evgeny, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you all. I've got a little PowerPoint which I'll briefly run through. I've been asked to talk for about 10 minutes, so that's all. So I'll just make a few introductory remarks. Apologies for not being able to be with you earlier on, but I was doing yet another webinar somewhere else. So they're very popular these days, that's for sure. So I don't know if I've got control of this slide or not. Do I control this? Let's see what happens. No. Could you move it along one slide, whoever's doing this? Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to raise a few questions and then open it up for a bit of discussion. One of the things I'll talk about a little bit briefly is about the nature of the Indo-Pacific and why we're all talking about that as a way of describing the region rather than talking about the Asia-Pacific or East Asia or some of the other possible ways of describing it. And many people, particularly in China, think that the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific is basically a way of some of the key countries of the region, the United States, Japan, Australia, and possibly India. It's just a key mechanism for trying to contain China, to respond to the rise of China, particularly as a security threat. So the major manifestation of this idea of the Indo-Pacific so far has been as this quadrilateral dialogue that includes the US, Japan, and Australia and India. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a little map of the Indo-Pacific, and you can see why policymakers in Australia might be very enthusiastic about this idea of the Indo-Pacific because we're right at the center of it, and it sort of makes sense in a way to conceptualize our region, as it were, in this kind of way. Interestingly, it was Japan who, more than anybody else, really kind of pioneered the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a possible region. And it's not surprising in a way because Japan has a terrible relationship with China, I think it's fair to say. A lot of history and bad blood between Japan and China. Japan's always been concerned about its vulnerability strategically. It's always been heavily reliant on the United States. It's always been concerned about the United States possibly pulling out of the region, whether it's the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. So this new formulation and the quadrilateral dialogue in particular, particularly when it includes another key American ally like Australia, this offers a way of potentially trying to keep the United States engaged with the region and to encourage greater solidarity between these other countries, and as a way of balancing the rise of China. So I think that's the kind of plan. The big question is, can India play the kind of role that the United States, Australia and Japan would like it to play, or will it have concerns of its own that may make it act in different kinds of ways and not be the kind of reliable partner that the others hope. And it's interesting, the debate in India seems to be quite diverse and divergent, and clearly they've got their own ideas about what they want to do, but some people in India are very enthusiastic about the quadrilateral dialogue and think that India should play a more prominent role. But others think that India's got its own kind of long-term agenda, and maybe having good relations with China is more important than being a predictable member of the quadrilateral dialogue. One big question about this grouping, as for others, is whether it's actually going to amount to anything in terms of formal institutionalization as anything other than a kind of strategic relationship between these four key countries. So if you could move it along one, please. So this is another little map of the Indo-Pacific region that's a bit broader focus, and you can see potentially it includes the United States, and potentially it has the same kinds of problems that afflicted the Asia-Pacific idea. That is that it's too big, too many members, includes too many things, and doesn't really have a central sense of identity or purpose to unify the actions of the different actors involved. Some people argue that even for a country like the United States, particularly when Mr. Trump is trying to, well, it depends which day of the week we're actually thinking about, but on occasions, Mr. Trump has suggested that he wants to reduce American defense spending. On occasions, he's suggested he wants to increase it. So where we're at, we don't know. But there are serious questions about whether America has the commitment to become a kind of an Indian Ocean power and presence in the way that it has been a Pacific Ocean power. And even in Australia, there's something of a debate. It's still relatively marginal, but there's a debate about whether America can be relied upon to be committed to the Pacific Ocean as a Pacific power in the long term, never mind having a commitment to the Indo-Pacific. So that's a really important question. But you can see from this map how important the trade routes through the Indo-Pacific region are, particularly around the Straits of Malacca. And it's worth remembering, of course, that China gets a lot of its energy supplies from the Middle East still, and controlling or having confidence in the ability to be able to transit through that part of the world is very important for all of the countries of the region, but China too. And if you're a policymaker in Beijing, you might be pretty concerned about the formation of this quadrilateral dialogue that may threaten your vital supply routes in the Indo-Pacific region. So is the question to ask, I guess, is the real purpose and point of this new idea of the Indo-Pacific principally to make life difficult for China, maybe not to lock it out because it's always going to be geographically part of the region, but to make it more difficult for it to assert its growing influence in the region if there's a mechanism with which some states can kind of push back and resist China's influence. So if you could move me along one, please. Okay, this is America in the Indo-Pacific, and there's a big question about what kind of rules, institutions, norms, and values are going to predominate in the Indo-Pacific. And recently, the United States, much to Australia's delight, has started to talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific, which means free to trade and commerce, and part of that kind of liberal international order that the United States helped to create in the aftermath of the Second World War, which Donald Trump doesn't really seem to recognize how valuable that has been for the United States. But Australia, and I think Japan too, are delighted to hear Trump at least using the rhetoric of the Indo-Pacific and promoting this idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Whether this actually fits with the kind of transactional America first foreign policy that it's such a distinguishing feature of the Trump administration is another question altogether, and maybe that's one we could discuss in Q&A perhaps. Can you do the next slide, please? This is just yet another map of the Indo-Pacific, one that highlights what Shinzo Abe, or Abe Shinzo, described as the kind of security diamond. And this was Abe's initial vision for the security dimension of the Indo-Pacific grouping. And it would be these quad states, the quadrilateral dialogue states. And the big question, I think, particularly from a Chinese perspective, but just generally, is who are these states aligning against? What's the central purpose of the quadrilateral dialogue? If it's not about strategic balancing, if it's not about containing China, why don't they invite China to join? Might be one question that the Chinese might be asking themselves. More pertinently for today's discussion, why hasn't Indonesia been invited to join? Because Indonesia is potentially a very important state in the future. It's an important swing state, potentially. It's got some history of siding with the United States at various times in its history. So if Indonesia decided to throw in its lot with the Quad states, that would be a pretty big statement and a pretty big loss for China in terms of its long-term influence and strategy in the Southeast Asian region, and the influence of the Belt and Road Initiative and those kinds of things. So Indonesia is a really important actor in all of this. It's difficult to know which way it's going to go. I think the general strategy amongst the ASEAN states is that they like to quote unquote hedge. Some people would say that's because they can't make up their mind exactly what they would like to do, particularly collectively. But I think Indonesia is a really important state in the long term, and its quasi-leadership of the ASEAN grouping over time will make it a very important country as well. And we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is a few just general questions and possible conclusions that we could have a discussion about, possibly. I think the containment strategy, I mean, lots of people think trying to contain China, trying to decouple from China is not a very promising or even feasible possibility. It's a big issue in Australia at the moment, but it would cause Australia more damage to try and decouple and diversify, certainly in the short term, than it would cause to China. So all of the countries of the region, their major trading partner, economic partner is China. So weighing up the costs and benefits of what the rise of China actually means is a really difficult and challenging problem for all of the countries of the region. And as I mentioned, it's particularly crucial for Indonesia because they have overlapping territorial claims with China. There's been some friction around the strategic relationship between Indonesia and China, but China's potentially is a hugely important economic partner. There's some interest in getting Chinese to invest in infrastructure in Indonesia as part of the Maritime Silk Road. So there are big issues for Indonesia to wrestle with and to try and think about. Now, you all know far more about Russian foreign policy than I do, so I won't try and tell you what is going on with Russia because it's slightly mysterious. But I think as far as looking at it from an Australian perspective, it seems that if this quadrilateral dialogue amounts to anything, with or without Indonesia, it's potentially not a good thing for Russia because Russia is arguably a pretty marginal player in this kind of, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, maybe even in the Asia-Pacific, but it's got not as much connection or as much influence as some of the other countries in the region. I mean, one possibility, and I'll be very interested to hear what you all think about this, is about Russia's relationship with China. Now, that's also got a bit of history as well, and I know that it hasn't always been a happy relationship, and I think there's some sensitivity in Russia, correct me if I'm wrong, about Russia being the sort of junior partner in this relationship, which is a very big change from the historical norm. So there's a lot of sensitivities about how this might play out, but maybe Russia and China do have some important and developing links. And if that actually amounted to something, I mean, people talk about a kind of grouping of more kind of authoritarian kind of regimes that are anti-American, not happy about the evolving international order, would like to see different kinds of norms and principles being put into place. Maybe there's some grounds for cooperation against this kind of evolving quadrilateral grouping. So I'd be very interested to hear what you all think about that. And you know, the worst case scenario in some ways is that the even before the kind of COVID-19 crisis emerged, I think we were beginning to see a lot of talk in America about decoupling, a lot of concern about over-reliance on China. So all of the kind of logic of economic interdependence that many of us took for granted for a long time, a lot of that is an open question now. And the kinds of economic and strategic relationships that are emerging out of this kind of crisis, some of them were in train anyway, and maybe what the crisis is doing is to throw quite a sharp kind of light on many of these issues, and maybe encouraging people to behave in ways that we wouldn't have expected beforehand. But I think if relationships start to break down, if economic interdependence starts to break down, that will be a bad move in my judgment. And I think the emergence of a kind of new Cold War would not be in anyone's interest. So anyway, a few observations and questions, and I'd be most interested to hear what you all think about it later on.
Thank you so much, Mark. Your presentation has been really insightful and intellectually inspiring, and my tentative suggestion is like this. We have one of our speakers is from Australia with the time difference of 5 hours, and also we have a speaker from Indonesia, and the time difference is 4 hours, and as our discussion may be too long, let's open a preliminary discussion, Q&A session here and now, and colleagues' suggestions, observations, comments, even points of criticism, all these things are welcomed. Who wants to speak? Well, as the moderator, I have the privilege to speak the first, and Mark, I would say that the narrative of the Indo-Pacific region seems to be a little bit overestimated owing to at least 3 factors. First, the coronavirus pandemic. In my opinion, it directly contradicts the letter and spirit of the free and open Indo-Pacific region, taking into consideration the trend to protectionism and restrictionism, and in case the present situation continues even, well, 2 or 3 months, the free and open agenda may disappear, well, in a natural way, because the connectivity narrative is undermined, and we cannot speak about liberalization. On the contrary, opposite trends prevail. This is the first point. The second point has to do with the American side of the story. Well, under the Obama administration, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the economic foundation of American Asia-Pacific policy. After the Trump administration administration came to power, the first thing that Trump did was to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do not you expect that the same fate can be with regard to the Indo-Pacific region? And finally, this is an expensive undertaking, and financial allocations are expected to be really significant in case the members of the Quadrilateral Defense Cooperation Group are serious about making the Indo-Pacific region as something long-term, as sustainable. They should understand that it requires money, and we may like it or dislike, but at present the only country that is ready to spend money is China. And the United States has a budget, a huge budget deficit, and also Japan and India tried to develop the Asia-African Economic Corridor, but they haven't succeeded. And Australia, as far as I am informed, as part of its step-up policy, invests mostly in the South Pacific small island states, and no one among the participants of the Quad is ready to bear this financial burden. And even one of these factors individually can seriously undermine the Indo-Pacific narrative as such, and what to speak about their aggregate effect. And I am driving at a simple conclusion. Do not you expect that this undertaking may be more short-lived as everybody expected some time ago, at least?
Okay, no, thanks for excellent questions. I'll start in reverse order, I think, because that's, I think, the last points pull together some of the general points, really. And that question about the willingness of the participants in the Quad to actually do more than just think about this in strategic terms. I mean, the point you were making about China, on the one hand, having the wherewithal and the political will that it wants to be a big player in the region. As far as we're aware at this stage of the game, that they have the means to actually invest in some of these things. There's some debate about this, about, you know, they've got some fairly serious internal problems, and it may not be as easy to do. And even apart from that, there's quite a bit of pushback from some of the countries that are actually promising to invest in, that they are worried about being overly dependent on China. And there's a couple of countries in the region. Malaysia's had problems, Philippines has had problems. So a number of countries have been kind of increasingly concerned about what getting too close to China might look like. So that's kind of part of the equation of how this is playing out. However, the big point is, and I think you're absolutely right about this, that the Americans, I can't remember how much they promised to put up. It was something like 90 million or 100 million dollars. It was an incredibly small amount of money in the overall scheme of things. I mean, you could probably put up an apartment block for about that much. So it was a very small, very tokenistic gesture about their contribution to infrastructure development in the Southeast Asian region. Whereas China is already putting its money where its mouth is, as they say in English, and actually investing, building, doing things in a way that they demonstrated that they can do domestically and they can do overseas as well. And when you consider that there is a absolutely fundamental infrastructure deficit and demand in the Southeast Asian region, then it's a pretty attractive deal. And even if they don't particularly like the idea of China being the dominant power in the region, even if they're nervous about some of China's territorial ambitions and claims in the region, then it's still hard to resist the attraction of desperately needed investment happening through somebody, because the Americans aren't going to do it, I don't think. Australia's not going to do it. Japan, to its credit, has been doing it to some extent and has made some significant investments in the region. But as we all know, Japan's got quite a history in the region as well. And there's still some lingering uncertainty about Japan's role. And there's some hesitancy about or unwillingness on Japan's part to play too high a profile role in actually being a regional leader. So there's a there's a kind of big regional leadership deficit. And it offers a big opportunity for China to occupy that kind of political space. And it's not at all obvious that the United States on its own certainly is capable of responding to that in an effective kind of way. And it's not obvious how the other countries are going to be able to fill that gap either. There's a lot of talk in Australia, not only about the Indo-Pacific, but about the role that so-called middle powers might play, either individually or collectively, preferably, in kind of influencing the development of the region. But I think a lot of that is wishful thinking at this stage, and we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But you're absolutely right that that's a big part of it. And I think, to go back to your point about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was a huge disappointment for Japan and Australia in particular, because they put a lot of work into making that deal a reality, and then a Trump administration immediately pulled out of it. So they were very disappointed in that. But interestingly, and this is pretty revealing, I think, about the durability of American presence in the region, that they didn't just throw their hands in the air and say, well, we're not going to have anything to do with you ever again after that. The strategic alliance persists. American strategic influence is still relied upon, rightly or wrongly, by Japan and Australia. And no matter what the Trump regime does, it seems, no matter how erratic or unpredictable it gets, Japan and Australia are still pretty locked into being firm supporters of the Trump administration, no matter what they do, and no matter how damaging their kind of diplomatic initiatives are at any kind of particular sort of time. So yes, there's a big question mark about the durability and the ability of the Americans and their allies to promote this kind of free and open Indo-Pacific idea as anything more than just that, an idea, a sort of statement, a bit of rhetoric. Making it into some kind of tangible reality will require, I think, putting some resources and investment into that in a way that seems unlikely at this stage.
Thank you so much. Well, colleagues, more questions, remarks? Dmitry Valentinovich, could you please outline your vision on these issues?
Yes, it was a very interesting presentation, and it was very useful presentation, because we have our point of view, we have our ideas based on our own experience, and here was a very interesting presentation based on Australian or Western base of experience. And it was very interesting and a lot of questions, because it's very difficult, you see, to begin the discussion, because in fact I have not only questions, but I have discussions. And the first question is about the military consent of Indo-Pacific line. You see, because from my point of view, we don't see any other we don't see any other directions in their development and any other purposes, but the purpose to hedge, to stop China. And the American purpose is really, we can see, it's the only purpose to form a military alliance against China. And from our point of view, from my point of view, I think it's not a point of discussion. Because you see American ideas that there should be only democratic countries that should take part in the Pacific, and the territory of Indo-Pacific is the same as the territory of Pacific Command military of the United States. So we can see this idea. The problem is how to arrange it, how to make this new bloc when India is want to rebalance its relations, want to continue good relations with Russia, for example, and India don't want to be real enemy with China because there are a lot of problems on the border, and so on. But from my point of view, the idea of Indo-Pacific is idea of a military bloc, and how United States will be able to arrange this bloc and what will be in future, we'll see. But the pandemic and the current situation, I think, show us, and the relations between China and the United States on the problem of coronavirus you see, we can see it's only accelerate the idea of military blocks and military confrontation in the Southeast Asia and in Indo-Pacific. We can see, for example, South China Sea. You see the American reaction on China-Vietnamese conflict there. And we can see that United States really want to show its military force, the same as China. And I want to add about Russia, because you wrote about marginal role of Russia in all these affairs. Maybe it's your point of view, but in fact, Russia can't be imagined a role, because you understand that if Russia will be together with China, it will be a very serious force. For example, you know, now in the South China Sea, there are some Russian military ships, vessels from the most modern vessels from the Pacific Fleet of Russia. And they also present there now. And I think it's a sign also of the seriousness of all the situation. And Russia can't be marginal force there, because Russia can choose what to do. And if Russia will go very close with China, I think the situation will be aggravated. It will be very difficult for the United States and for all this idea of Indo-Pacific. It's my point. I have a lot of other, how to say, ideas and questions about this brilliant presentation, but I think that it will be our discussion, and I'll stop on this, but I have a lot of to say also about this presentation.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the comments, and I don't disagree with you actually at all about. I think you're right to suggest that the principal point of this grouping is strategic. It does represent, certainly in the potentially at least, as far as many of the Australia and Japan certainly. The US is kind of really interesting at the moment, because the leadership in the US is so erratic and unpredictable. It's very difficult to be certain what the Trump administration may do. Now, the big hope in America, of course, is that Trump will lose the election in November. Biden will get in, and we'll go back to kind of business as usual next year. And that may or may not be true. I mean, I wouldn't write off Trump as being absolutely bound to lose this election at all, actually, because there are a lot of people in America who think that he's a good guy and he's standing up for American interests. So it's not a foregone conclusion. But whatever happens, even if Biden gets in, there's still a question about what American policy towards the Indo-Pacific, towards a long-term strategic commitment to that part of the world will be. Because I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that America is in relative decline compared to China. China at the moment is still on an upward trajectory, and it's still catching up, and by many accounts will overtake the United States as the biggest economy in the world, and that will give it a capacity to become a more important strategic actor. So at a fundamental level, the kind of balance of power, if you like, is changing a bit, at least in China's favor. And if your country, Russia, decides to more closely cooperate with China, I mean, that would be a pretty formidable combination. I don't know enough about China-Russian relations at this point in time to know how feasible, sustainable, trustworthy that kind of relationship would be, because there's a bit of history between Russia and China, as we know. So if the only thing that was keeping Russia and China together was a dislike of the United States and the kind of normative order, at least at the level of rhetoric that it's championing, then I don't know how durable and effective that would be. And the kind of potential for miscalculation and disaster from greater militarization of the South China Sea, I think is something to be given serious consideration as well. I mean, there's a colleague of mine in Australia who you may or may not have heard of, Hugh White, who's written a very good book about the China choice, about America's policy in the Pacific region. And Hugh White argues pretty persuasively, I think, that at some stage the United States will have to make a decision about whether it's actually worth risking all-out war with China to maintain its position as an Asia-Pacific, never mind an Indo-Pacific power, whether it's worth taking that risk that they could get into a major conflict with China. And he thinks over time the calculation that American policymakers will make will change over time, and eventually they will decide to pull out of the region because it's just not worth the risk from the calculation. So that could be a very big transformation for this part of the world. It would mean an end to the Indo-Pacific security architecture, I think, amongst other things, but it would also raise interesting and complex problems for Russia and Indonesia, of course, because if the Americans pull out, then East Asia will effectively be a Chinese sphere of influence. That will have big implications for the countries of East Asia, but I'm guessing it would also have pretty serious implications for Russia, because China would be even more the kind of regional hegemonic presence, and I'm guessing that Russia would be even more a kind of less influential part of that overall security picture. But you all know more about that than I do, so I'd be interested to hear your views.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. Possibly our Indonesian friends want to add some points. Your Excellency, you spoke about the Australian factor in the present-day Indonesian priorities. Could you please make some points now?
Well, thank you very much. I just would like to look at the back to the history of the Indo-Pacific, which actually first one who used the term was Indian marine strategist and executive director of the New Delhi National Marine Foundation. But then the meaning has been changing, especially after the United States introduced the idea of Indo-Pacific strategy. The US concept of the Indo-Pacific strategy inherits of the ground laid by Obama administration, a pivot or rebalance Asia. But unlike Obama concepts, Indo-Pacific concepts by Mr. Trump clearly declare that China as revisionist power, and US expect allies and partners to shoulder the burden of responsibility to protect against common threats. During his address in Vietnam in APEC summit, for example, President Trump said that US and India should partner to further free and open Indo-Pacific, upholding the rule of law and the freedom of navigation, which China did not. This concept, since then, I think, been welcomed by Japan and Australia. But we in Indonesia have some different concepts. First, actually, stated by our foreign minister, looking at the unhealthy discourse between big powers. During his speech at the Washington Strategic Center for Strategic and International Studies, Mr. Martin Natalegawa, our foreign minister, laid out Indonesia's perspective on Indo-Pacific, arguing that the future of Indo-Pacific would hold new international architecture connecting two into Indo-Pacific framework. So one point he attributed is the Indo-Pacific states work toward developing Indo-Pacific treaty of friendship and cooperation, like those in ASEAN, TAC, Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. The idea then is developed by Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi during her speech at Jakarta Center for Strategic and International Studies Center on the 16th of May, which she proposed that Indonesia's version of Indo-Pacific based on the principle of openness, transparency, inclusiveness, dialogue, cooperation, friendship, and upholding international law. Areas of cooperation could be maritime security, connectivity, and sustainable development. On 9 August, Minister Retno formally presented the Indonesian concept of Indo-Pacific during the 8th ministerial meeting in the East Asia Summit, which he assured that other ministers that the proposal was not to create new mechanism or to replace existing one like the East Asia Economic Summit and so on, but to enhance cooperation using existing mechanism. The idea also then been proposed to ASEAN during the foreign minister retreat in Chiang Mai, in China, no, in Thailand, sorry. Yeah, in Chiang Mai on the 21st January, which the minister attended, well, did not actually completely agree, but they noted the progress of deliberation on the ASEAN collective approach into Indo-Pacific outlook. And during the 31st summit in Bangkok of ASEAN Summit 22nd, 23rd June, ASEAN leaders finally adopted the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific proposed by Indonesia. The outlook is not aimed at creating new mechanisms or replacing existing one. It is intended to enhance ASEAN community building process and to strengthen and give momentum for ASEAN-led mechanism, or in other words, it's the centrality of ASEAN, the role of ASEAN in this very dividing world. This is not, of course, a complete idea. It's still on process, and we still have to look for other ideas from different countries in the region. And it's also important to look at what is the Russia response on this idea. I didn't have a very formal response, but with our intensive communication with the Russian side, basically, Russian is accommodative to the idea of ASEAN centrality. And one thing that he questioned is the area of the Indo-Pacific. You know, who could decide which country will be included and not? I think this is what is usually questioned informally by our Russian colleague about the idea of Indo-Pacific. But basically, they support the centrality of ASEAN. I think that's what I can say about the Indo-Pacific, but it's still an ongoing process.
Hey, Mark, would you like to react?
Well, I'm happy to say a couple of things, but I'm not sure the ambassador is going to be very happy with what I say, because I don't know, I'm a bit of an ASEAN skeptic, I'm afraid to say. And I think in principle, it's a fantastic organization. It's been in place for a long time. And I'm sure the meetings that the ASEAN officials do contribute to a bit of confidence building and understanding amongst the diplomatic elites of the region. And I'm sure that's all good. However, at the moment, Southeast Asia, ASEAN in particular, is being faced with arguably the biggest challenge of its entire existence, i.e. the rise of China, not only as an economic powerhouse in the region and potential competitor with some of the things that the ASEAN states do, but also, more importantly, as a huge strategic actor and potential threat directly to some of the ASEAN states. And I'm sure you know far more about this than I do, but the Philippines famously, Duterte came to power saying, we're going to stand up to China, we're going to reclaim the territorial disputed claims and impose Philippine sovereignty over them again. Other countries have suggested that they may be unhappy with some aspects of Chinese behavior. The point to emphasize is that there is no collective, coherent position from the ASEAN grouping about how to respond to the rise of China, because the central dilemma is China more of a threat than an opportunity? And different countries within the ASEAN grouping are coming to different conclusions about how that kind of works out. Now, Laos, for example, has come to the conclusion that China is a much bigger economic opportunity than it is a strategic threat. And so they are never going to do anything to criticize China. And that means that ASEAN consensus is pretty well impossible to achieve on anything that is critical of China now. So the problem about that really is this idea of ASEAN centrality, which is such a big part of the rhetoric around the ASEAN grouping and Southeast Asia generally, is very difficult to achieve because there's no coherent position on the part of ASEAN as far as I can see, and they are very dependent on, influenced by greater powers like China, who they've got to try and figure out how to deal with. And as we were talking about before, some countries, including Indonesia, are quite keen to get more investment from China, and that obviously constrains what your country can do in response to the kind of challenges that China presents. So I think for all the countries of the region, it's a big challenge, that is responding to China. But the problem is that different countries are making different calculations about what they should be doing or could be doing. And so there's no unified ASEAN position about how to respond to the China challenge. And that's making, I won't say the grouping irrelevant, but it's making them less effective than they might be otherwise, I think. And that's going to be a continuing challenge, because any organization that's based on trying to achieve consensus and agreement like that it's going to struggle to find uniformity on this particular issue, it seems to me. So I apologize for being somewhat skeptical, but I just think there's some evidence to support that kind of position.
Okay, Mark, thanks again. And I suppose we should be both skeptical and realistic about what is going on in our very complicated world, and skepticism means that we really make realistic assessments and judgments. Okay, Mark, thank you very much again. And now, in case there are no more comments or questions, let me give the floor to our next speaker, Bapak Gedevahyo Wicaksana dari Universitas Airlangga. And he is going to speak also about the Indo-Pacific region, Indonesia in the rising Indo-Pacific region, how a middle power manages great powers. I suppose that this presentation will be as interesting as everything that we have seen and heard today. Okay, Bapak, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity for me to deliver my ideas in this very interesting forum. But first of all, let me apologize because I haven't got enough time to present a PowerPoint or a short paper for this time meeting, because these days are very busy with routine universities work at the end of the semester. But to be honest, I'm very interested in the topic. First, because Indonesia and Russia relations are area which is not much explored by scholars, and this is my opportunity to study more about this area of bilateral relationship. And secondly, I can bring a context of today's regional development, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, which Mark has explained very clearly and very interesting. I have 3 points to say today at this meeting, and my opinion is a bit critical about seeing how Russia and Indonesia develop relationship in the context of the Indo-Pacific. I frame my discussion in a concept of middle power, middle power is not simply a state whose physical or tangible powers are less than great powers and bigger than weak power, but middle powers is powers who develop rule-based orders in international politics, and power who deals with great powers in their own way. They do not particularly follow in what realists argue as balancing or bandwagoning and others. And I learned from Marx concepts of great power, middle power, in which this cluster of states need to have a good momentum to get their role significance in regional or global order. Based on this conception, I looks at some histories of Indonesian foreign policy, which is called bebas aktif or independent and active. I interpret independent and active as not non-block or non-alignment, simply impartial, but Indonesia is free to choose to whom it wants to cooperate and actively struggle for its national interests. So it's very, very active stream of foreign policy thinking, where state can move from one point to another in accordance with what they think, what their leaders think are the most important interests to achieve. In 1960s, Indonesia can bridge between the Soviet Union and the United States. Sukarno flexibly talked to Khrushchev and Kennedy, and during the Cold War, situations are a bit different, though Indonesia still tries to maintain its independent and active. My second point is the independent and active is not supported by enough national capabilities, strong military forces. In 1960s, the Soviet Union helped Indonesia to develop its military capabilities, and while under Suharto, some high echelon military ranks were trained in the Soviet Union in intelligence sectors and security and defense affairs. Indonesia is also not capable to manage its natural resource to police its very large archipelago, and these combinations of problems made Indonesia is actually not strong enough to control its region. What Indonesia can do is to develop rule-based interaction among states, among regional states, in many forms of multilateralisms. One which is most prominent is ASEAN. Although I'm not optimistic actually about ASEAN, because it seems to me like too passive and rather difficult regional organization to reform. It's quite quiet diplomacy. It's too much reluctance on applying sanction to countries which violates regional commitments. But Indonesia has to do that, because only by rule-based order Indonesia can play its role in international relations. And the third thing is today's regionalism is different from what Indonesia has developed 20 or 30 years ago. More regional initiatives come from non-Asian states, from China, Japan, South Korea, from the US, and extra-regional power. Then it comes in the form of what we see now as Indo-Pacific. Now, for the context of strategic relationship between Russia and Indonesia, I have two questions. One, what Russia can contribute while Indonesia placed China as its most important economic partner, see the US as the most reliable security and military partner, and other Asian regional powers as trusted friends in the region. What Russia can contribute to supporting Indonesia's role-based order. The most important security issue for Indonesia today is South China Sea on territorial disputes, and what Russia can contribute. And secondly, about Indonesia and Russia relations is the growing nationalistic economic policies in major resource powers of the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Indonesia is nationalistic, Russia is also nationalistic, and most resource-rich countries in the regions are growing to be inward-looking in their economic policies. So how Indonesia and Russia deal with these situations, these are two main problems which I see as the points of Russia and Indonesia relationships today. I think it's all from me. Questions and comments are most welcome. Thanks very much.
Okay, colleagues, as usual, our Q&A session is open, and possibly, Your Excellency, would you like to be the first to start this Q&A session? With the specific relevance to the relations between Russia and Indonesia?
Maybe not, question, but just like to first to comment on Mark's statement first that the position, of course, it's not easy for ASEAN to deal with these two bloc powers, but of course, it's not impossible to do the thing. If we look at the history of ASEAN, we consist of countries with so diverse background. From economically, we are so diverse. Even we have different ideology, but I think this is the most successful organization in the world. We understand that the interest, of US and China different, and also with the growing tension in the South China Sea also will shape the nature of relations also been developing. But we still believe in the use of diplomacy, non-violence, and rule-of-based international law and so on. And on the strategic partnership, as I mentioned, this is the foundation that we'd like to create to broaden our relations, because once the partnership is signed, there'll be more formal institutionalized mechanism that follow, like what we have done with some different countries. We have signed with 14 countries, including Australia.
Thank you so much. Well, I see that Alina Vladimirovna wants to have a word about the presentation. Alina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I have questions that is rising during the last two presentations, because we started to talk about power and ASEAN centrality. and ability to influence the rules of game in the region. And for me, it's quite a little bit tricky and a little bit catchy situation, because people speak about military power, about trade power, economic power, and it seems that ASEAN and Indonesia in general is considered like countries that almost have no possibility to influence. And a couple of years ago in our center, in Institute of Oriental Studies, we actually also had some discussion about ASEAN centrality and ability to influence, especially in the present of rise of China and challenges China brings to nowadays. And important issue was dimension, because there is different resources of power. I don't really like now soft power term, because it's difficult to measure empirically, especially with quantitative methods. But we know that there is wonderful concept like normative power. And at some point, I've made a network of international trade treaties, which is like preferential trade agreements. And we found out that ASEAN actually has quite a central position in this network. I actually can show the picture, the graph to get to have an argument, but unfortunately, as I wasn't prepared for this discussion to this extent, it's only in Russian, but maybe it will be interesting to see. So if the moderator is okay, I'll just show you this small picture. So it's quite easy to understand. I suppose you can see it, yeah, now. So basically, it's a network of treaties, which was like trade agreements for like many years. And if we look at the center of these treaties, we can see actually the ASEAN. The colors, it's in Russian, but basically it's regions. So yellow region, it's Asia, and like green, it's this block, it's actually Europe. This is Africa. Here is like we see USA. So we can see that if we talk about trade and about like military resources of power, there is no ASEAN centrality, that's true. But if we talk about normative power, and that's countries of ASEAN concludes different agreements, and this way they're able to write down some norms that will later implemented, that's actually possible to say that these countries has a very important role, and Indonesia is also one of these countries that can actually influence. So my question is really why we talk only about military or about like trade flows when there is so many other dimensions of power that actually can be important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, friends, very timely and relevant remarks, but we have to move further. And I am happy to give the floor to Professor Masikov, who is going to speak about also about the Indo-Pacific region and its relevance to the present-day Indonesian foreign policy. Dmitry Valentinovich, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. So my presentation, the title is Indonesia in Emerging Indo-Pacific Region, Challenges and Prospects. I think that today, during our conference, we have already discussed the problem of Indo-Pacific region. We discussed different elements of current political process. And I want to tell directly and shortly about the Indonesia dilemma. It's not only Indonesia dilemma, but it's also a dilemma for all ASEAN countries. Mark said that the dilemma for Southeast Asian countries is dilemma of the rising China. What to do? It's a challenge or it's a danger. But I think that it's not only one dilemma that is before countries of Southeast Asia. I think the most serious dilemma is where to be, to continue the Asia-Pacific project or to go to the Indo-Pacific project, because we can see there is a great change and a great difference between Asia-Pacific project and Indo-Pacific project, because in Asia-Pacific project we can see China and United States and other countries, and in Indo-Pacific project we don't see China, and we see India, United States, Australia, and Japan. And from this point of view, the challenge is, and what to do for Southeast Asian countries, for ASEAN countries, how to rebalance its policy to be in normal relations, to continue relations in all the spheres with China, to continue relations with the United States, to develop relations with India, when the situation is aggravating from one month to another month, because there are contradictions between China and the United States, now we can see are very acute. And I have already told that the idea of Indo-Pacific is the idea how to stop China, how to make a, how to say, new project, geopolitical project, and to stop China from the military point of view, because we can see, I have already told you that the territory of Indo-Pacific is the same as the territory for control of American Pacific Command, and I've already told you that the Indo-Pacific will have some ideology. It's very unusual for the United States policy, but it will have ideology that American politicians, different from Tillerson to Pompeo, they said that in Indo-Pacific should be only democratic countries. What it means? All ASEAN countries, they are democratic. Even Vietnam also, they think that Vietnam is a purely democratic country. But China is not democratic. And so on this element, China will not be able, even if China, for example, we can imagine, will decide to also to take part in this project, will not be able to take part in this project. So the idea of Asia-Pacific, I think, on the other side, is the idea of common market with China, developing relations with China. And in Southeast Asia, all the countries, they know China's opinion on Indo-Pacific project. Its opinion is very critical, and China rejected and accused all this project as anti-Chinese project. So what to do? I think there was a period of how to say, of stalemate in ASEAN politics, when they thought how to rebalance its policy. And then I think that they made a very good and a very right decision. And this decision was based on Indonesian politics, because it's Indonesia said, yes, we'll go to Indo-Pacific, but we'll go to Indo-Pacific on our own rules, not as a military bloc, not as a military union, but somehow to develop Asia, East Asian summits, or how maybe to develop, how to say, the economic zone, free economic zone for cooperation. And so there was another vision, and now we can see this another vision. I don't want to say when it was adopted in Bangkok as an ASEAN idea, but in fact it was Indonesian suggestion, and it was made in Indonesia what to do with the Indo-Pacific project, how to make opinion of countries of Southeast Asia to this new great project. And I think it was very right decision. We'll go there, will not reject this decision, this project, but will make new sense to this project, from the military one to economic cooperation, to friendship, to different relations, and the idea that in this project other countries should take part, not only India, but China and even Russia, because if we'll see some articles and other things, we'll see that politicians say that in this new Indo-Pacific project should take part not only China and Chinese representatives, but also Russian and Russian representatives. And it's very important because from the point of view of the United States, and even in all the maps, for example, as Mark showed this map, there was a map of Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific region without Russia, because Russia is a very huge power, and all northeast of Asia-Pacific is Russian territories. And so Russia, as a Pacific country, also wants to take part and to influence on the process that now we can see in this region. And I think that that's the main problem for ASEAN countries and for Indonesia, the main dilemma, how to implement this plan to the current situation, how to change the direction towards military bloc against China, to stop China, to another direction for cooperation, for friendship, for participation of all Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean countries, and as an open market for cooperation and different relations. And that's, from my point of view, the main dilemma today for ASEAN countries, because we can see that the ASEAN centrality that Russia supports can be in Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific projects, because geographically, Southeast Asia is really in the middle of all this vast region. And the position of Southeast Asian country is very important for Asia-Pacific project and for Indo-Pacific project also. And that's why what to do, how to do. I think that the main idea is to go together with India, because I think that India also has very close to Southeast Asian countries, to ASEAN countries, the same vision of the future Indo-Pacific region. Because even Narendra Modi and other important politicians from India, they said that yes, we agree for Indo-Pacific project. It's very interesting, it's very favorable for India, because India becoming a very important country in all the Pacific and Indo-Pacific projects. But we want also not a military bloc. We also want Indo-Pacific as a place for open cooperation. And we think that other Pacific countries, even China and Russia, also will take part in this project. And the problem now, from my point of view, is how India and ASEAN countries will be able to persuade United States, or somehow maybe Japan and Australia or other areas of the United States, they go along the military line to change this direction and to go to this idea, the idea of open, free and open Indo-Pacific, but free and open for everyone, without any ideological ideas, without any geographical limits. And that will be really a question, the main question today for Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. How we'll be able, we can implement this idea, how we can change the direction of political process from direction to military blocs and military contradictions and military conflicts to another idea, to idea of economic political cooperation, free and open region, really free and open from the economical, political, and cultural and other points of view. That's the idea. And another moment, I want to say it's very acute idea. It's we can't wait for the period for discussions, because we can see the situation in the South China Sea as an example that the contradictions and the conflict is growing, the contradictions are growing. And we have to find methods how to calm the situation, how to find methods to stop these contradictions. And pandemic and all that connected with all this situation, I think that can stop these activities, because we don't know the picture of post-pandemic world. Maybe it will not be so open, maybe it will not be so free, maybe once again we'll come to national states, national borders, maybe once again we'll come to tariffs and to stop open trade. And that's a very serious problem, because if we'll go that way, the perspective for military direction and for military future for East Asia and Asia Pacific will be very, I think, will be real. And that's why I think that the role of Russia should be to be together with ASEAN and India in their idea to make this new road for cooperation and peace, and not road for military bloc. And that's, from my point of view, can be a very serious and very important role of our country. It's not a military, role. It's not a political, even economical role. It can be to be together to make the future for this vast region on the basis of cooperation and friendship. And I think in this point, we can say about strategic cooperation or comprehensive strategic cooperation between Russia and Indonesia, because Indonesia that prepared this idea, this direction, and in different conferences, in discussions inside the country, then in ASEAN, and then it was adopted by all ASEAN countries. And the Russian view on this problem, on the progress of the future of Indo-Pacific project, so close to each other that they can do policy together fight for peaceful direction, together fight for another picture of post-pandemic world in Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific region. And this, I think, it's a very solid foundation for our mutual activities and for our mutual politics. And I think that together, I don't speak about China because it's a special topic, China's-American relations. It's a special topic, but I speak only about Indonesia as a greatest and the most strong country in Southeast Asia, and Russia, also very strong and also a participant of Pacific Rim. Yes, to do a policy together for peaceful, for friendship, for open markets, for open trade, for open borders. And I think this is a very good purpose that can be reached together by Indonesia and Russia. And I wish that soon we'll see these activities, this policy will be fulfilled together, and we'll see good objectives of this policy. I wish about this, and I think we can be able, if we'll do this policy together, we'll receive success in future. I think so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Masykov. Mark, I see your hand. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I've got a couple of quick questions, and I'm going to have to leave after this when I hear the answer. But the first question is about you mentioned earlier in one of your interjections, I think it's Professor Olmos, isn't it? So, so anyway, you're Professor Olmos?
No, this is Professor Masykov.
Oh, okay, sorry. It says Olmos on your screen, but anyway.
No.
Okay, never mind. Anyway, you mentioned before about Russia being a closer relationship strategically with China. Now, that may be true, and that may happen, but if that's true, the other point you mentioned was one of the biggest concerns that Indonesia has is China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. So how do you reconcile those two things? Russia being friends with China, maybe a strategic partner of China's, and being friendly with Indonesia when Indonesia's principal security concern is about China's more assertive policies in the South China Sea. So that's one issue. The other thing I might read, I think it was might have been Alina who asked the question before about the fact that we hadn't really talked about norms and values and those kinds of things and other forms of power. And that's an interesting and important point. Now, in your presentation, you raised the idea about is the freedom of FOIP, what's it stand for again? Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Is the Free and Open Indo-Pacific idea compatible with different ideologies? In other words, it should be free of ideology. But my point about this would be, here's a suggestion, that the FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific idea, is an ideology. It's an expression of American liberal ideology and one that's been promoted by them for decades. So what do you think of this? A couple of questions there, and it goes back to Wahoo's presentation as well. He might want to say something about it as well, perhaps.
Yes, about ideology, I want to tell you the example of ASEAN countries. You see, of ASEAN, you see countries with different ideology. We can see here Communist Vietnam, pro-communist and authoritarian Cambodia, Laos, democratic Indonesia, yes, democratic or somehow Philippines. So we can see different ideologies in all the countries. For example, it's very difficult, for example, to compare Vietnam on one side and Indonesia, for example, or Singapore on another side, or Malaysia, and so on. And so we can see that in the difference, for example, for Eastern Europe, where we could see that all the communist regime were ruined and all were changed for Western style of politics and Western ideology. In Southeast Asia, we can see that Vietnam and Cambodia and even Laos, they still, on one side, they entered ASEAN, they take part in the work of ASEAN, but on the other side, they continue to be communist countries with their specific regimes, without with the specific ideology. And this ideology doesn't prevent them from making common policy and from making common views on different problems. It's not a problem even for economic cooperation. So from this point of view, even if China, for example, or Russia is not a communist country, you know, and you see ideology, for example, you compare China and Vietnam, the same communist party, you know, the communist party there and communist party there, but you see their relations very complicated and very, how to say, it's dangerous for a peaceful situation in the region. So from my point of view, ideology is the method to stop China from entering this region. You see, once again, because when the United States began its, how to say, its economic cooperation with China in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping visited Washington before Vietnamese invasion in Cambodia, for example, yes, from that time it was not important for United States that in China still continue communist regime, you see, and a lot of money United States sent to China, yes. So from my point of view, ideology is an obstacle. When you need an obstacle for some process, you open ideology, say, oh, this country, oh, it's a communist country with a totalitarian regime, it's something impossible, it can't take part in our democratic alliance. But if you need this country, for example, Vietnam, the same inside the country, you can see Communist Party, normal communist regime with political leaders in all the levels. But from American point of view, Vietnam is almost a democratic country, very close to democratic values. It's I can laugh, but you also can laugh. But because now Vietnam, or United States needs Vietnam as a frontier against China. And United States wants to make Vietnam somehow an enemy of China and to make China new problems with Vietnam. And in this way, they say Vietnam is a right country, it's a good country. And so we help Vietnam, yes, and no ideology. But when China maybe, for example, will take part in the Indo-Pacific project, for example, or China will not be able to take part in this project because China is a communist country and only democratic country can take part there. And Vietnam also is, how to say, also will take part maybe in this project. So we can see, from my point of view, ideology is not an important thing. It's important thing only when your political purposes is go along with ideology or against ideology. And in this time, you try to find some obstacles. And at this time, ideology is a very good thing. You think very quickly, you say, oh, we can't do this. For example, do this cooperation because your ideology is totalitarian, is against us. You see so a lot of people in your prisons and so on. No problems. But when you need another country, you say no ideology. You're good guys, so you'll do the right policy and we'll help you. That's my point of view, and that's from this point of view. It's not important question. It's not important point in the future in the Pacific. Ideology. It's second or third from my point of view. Maybe you have another point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, colleagues, are there any other comments or suggestions or remarks? Okay. Well,
may I have?
Of course, you are welcome.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Fahru Rozi from the University of Indonesia. So this is my opinion about the emergence of Indo-Pacific. I remember the concept of geopolitical concept of the classic geopolitics, like Harvard Mackinder and so on. So the emergence of Indo-Pacific, I think, is like reproduction of geopolitical struggle between sea power and heartland. I mean, when before the emergence of the Pacific, we know that, for example, in 1996, Russia and Russia and China, and then several countries made a group like Shanghai Five, and then it became a bigger in 2001. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think the concept of Indo-Pacific is like a contending geopolitical project of the SCO. So I think this is like, in my opinion, the enemy of quote unquote of the rival of the group of the project is not China, but China, for I think it's only like a temporary target. I think the most important is the struggle between Eurasianism. I mean, the concept of Eurasia that was created and built by Russia. As we know that the concept is not new. It is built in. It was formed in the early of 20th century, when Eurasian is like Trubetskoy and then Savitsky. They introduced the concept that Russia have to more close to the east than the west. So I just want to ask to Professor Mark and also Professor Mastukov about this opinion. because I think the China is, we know that China, the rising China is also important for America, but the ideological or geopolitical struggle is like low in the geopolitical geopolitical as knowledge, as theory. So this is my opinion, just to and for Indonesia or other country in this area in Southeast Asia, especially, is always in the spectrum of their influence of the struggle. I mean, when the Russia and other continental power, they make like a group, so the sea power they also make such contending project, just to make sure that their influence in the area is still secure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Mark, would you like to be the first to respond?
It's a complex set of issues, and this big question is whether policymakers generally take a great deal of notice of anything that theoreticians and people like us actually say or think or do. I think there are some cases where you get policymakers who are actually practitioners as well, people like Henry Kissinger or people like that. Clearly, they know about the theory and they know about the practice, but I think they tend to be the exceptions. But I gather, I think I'm right in saying that in Russia, geopolitics, the thinking about it, ideas about Eurasia, this kind of big picture view of the role and purpose of nations and their place in the world, that's taken much more seriously, I believe, than it is in, say, a country like Australia. And I think, part of it, it's, there's an English expression, it goes with the territory. So if you're a big and powerful country, I think you have a view of yourself and your role in the world that's different from middle powers like Australia or Indonesia, because they're never going to really kind of shake things up in quite the same way historically that Russia has, China has, the United States has. So I think there's a difference about the way that countries and the policymakers who control them and their histories think about the world and the kind of policies that might emerge as a consequence. And there's another English expression, delusions of grandeur. I mean, I think that can sometimes affect policymakers when they're thinking about what they could do or should do because of the countries they come from. I'm going to have to leave, I'm afraid, guys. But it's been great talking to you all. I've really enjoyed it, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to go. So thank you very much for inviting me again.
Mark, thank you. Thank you very much. It has been a real pleasure to speak to you, and hope to see you again.
Indeed, indeed. Take care.
Thank you again. Dmitry Valentinovich, what would you answer?
You see, the most important thing is that Great Eurasia is not a military project. Great Eurasia is a very huge project for maybe for 1 century, maybe for 2 centuries. This project is not connected even with the current political process. It's somehow the idea, the global idea of Russia, of a future Russian role, Russian place in the world that will be or can be or may be in 100 years or 100.5 years. So when will not be here in this world? Because the idea of Great Eurasia, you have to understand, it's the idea of open society, the idea of how to say, all the plains from Portugal to Pacific Ocean, from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific Ocean, from Ice Ocean to Southeast Asia, as an open space. space for cooperation, open space for people going to different countries. So this idea maybe of how to say it's of the world of the future, without conflicts, without contradictions, a world that will go to a very stable peace, a world that will have a very good administrative mechanism to stop aggression, to stop different conflicts and contradictions. I think maybe if it is real today, it's somehow to say it's impossible even to imagine such a world where Europe, China, Southeast Asia, Russia, Japan, all will take part, and this world will be based on common rules, of common understanding, on common ideology. So it's very difficult to imagine all this. But the idea is to go slowly, step by step, to realize this project. The fantastic of this project can't stop us from going slowly and slowly to make our world more peaceful, to make our world more open, to find possibilities to stop wars, to stop different conflicts. I think that's the main idea. How to say, as it was in the beginning of the 20th century, the Bernstein, I said, one of the great social democrats of that world, said about socialism: the purpose is nothing, but the movement is the main thing. The same we can say about this great Eurasia. So the purpose is nothing. It's very difficult to come to this situation. But the movement towards peace, stability, cooperation, and openness is very important. And from this point of view, this idea of Great Eurasia is very useful, and is very, I think that it's not very much popular in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, or really by this question, I understood that some scholars, they think that this is idea of aggression, or this is an idea of something, how to say, against their national interest. No, this idea of future world, of a world of peace, stability, and the problem is how to come to this purpose. And I think that the idea step by step go towards peace and stability, it's a very good choice, and we'll have to support it, and we'll have to know that this idea will go to peace and stability and for resolving different conflicts. And that's my answer. Don't afraid of Great Eurasia. It's a very good idea. It's a fantastic idea, but the road towards realizing the points of this idea can be very effective for peace and stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Masakov. Well, it's high time we give the floor to our next speaker, and His Excellency Bapak Wahid Supriyadi will be speaking about Russia and Indonesia between the Indo-Pacific region and the Greater Eurasian Partnership. Bapak Supriyadi, the floor is yours. We are ready to listen to you. You're welcome.
Well, I think I did already, so that's more than enough what I said already before on the, I mentioned already about the history of the Pacific and the standpoint by US, America, and ASEAN. I think I already mentioned that. So I don't think that I need to clarify again about what I said.
Okay, then now it's my turn, and I ask my assistants to upload my presentation. Oля, could you please do it? Well, and what I will be speaking about is a follow-up to what Professor Masakov has just described, the Greater Eurasia, implications for Russia-ASEAN relationship. Well, friends, much has been said and written about the Greater Eurasia, and in fact, I have been among those experts who elaborated on this concept with relevant to Southeast Asia. And here and now, let me tell you this. At present, the Greater Eurasia seems to encounter a serious imbalance, an imbalance between its prerequisites and its instruments. I mean, by saying instruments, the mechanisms by means of which the concept Greater Eurasian Partnership may be practically implemented. And this gap seems to be wide, and in my opinion, more efforts should be implemented so that to rectify it and to make the concept really workable. Okay, so far as the key prerequisites are concerned, let me tell you that the key point stems from China's policy. China has offered the world its mega project, and I would even go as far as to say that this is the new global division of labor under China's supervision and under China's guidance. The Belt and Road Initiative means strengthening relations between China and its neighbors, and specifically between China and its distant neighbor, the European Union. And this process, I mean China's march west, is the key point which is behind the idea of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. And to join this process is better than to stay aside, and in case you join, you can give your share of China's pie, and also you can participate in this project, and by means of this participation to monitor it and to have some safety mechanisms against unfortunate twists and turns of events which may easily happen. Okay, Russia's turn east. I wouldn't exaggerate its significance, and here I would say that Russia's role is secondary to China's, and its role as part of the Greater Eurasia is to form a positive, favorable international milieu around China to allow Beijing to implement its policy, not to undermine its policy, and I would say create a scenario under which China will not be busy trying to, expecting something bad from Russia. On the contrary, China's hands will be free, and China will be implementing its policy without having to look at Russia. And also the dissatisfaction of Eurasian partners with the unipolar world order. This is the final prerequisite, but here, friends, I would say that this is the negative rather than the positive motivation. We are against such and such manifestations of American policy rather than we want to share efforts in order to achieve something together. These 3 points are the key prerequisites of the Greater Eurasian idea. And the next slide, please. Here you see the degree of China's and Russia's influence in the Eurasia, and you see that Russia is very unlikely to outperform China as one of the pillars of the Eurasian project, because it is China that sets the tone in implementing this mega strategy. The next slide, please. Okay, what about the instruments by means of which the Greater Eurasian Partnership can be implemented? I could say that this is an idea rather than a project, because this idea hasn't been substantiated by really strong instruments and mechanisms in order to translate it from vision into reality. Well, I suppose that the Greater Eurasian Partnership as a as an international project cannot be implemented without India. And taking into consideration that India is apprehensive about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the cornerstone of the Greater Eurasian Partnership, I have a logical question. Which goes to you all. Can the Greater Eurasian Partnership be without India or be with India as a reluctant power? Also, the connectivity factor matters. In case, well, I would say that we may like or dislike the People's Republic of China, but now it's the only international actor which is ready to invest in the Eurasian infrastructure. China gives money, no one else does it. But at present, in the present day coronavirus pandemic, China seems to have suspended many projects, for example, within the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which are not of the primary significance for China, and China has to resolve many problems related to its public health sector, and also the COVID pandemic has hit China very strongly, and taking this into consideration, I would say that China will not spend its money as willingly as it did even a short time ago. Okay. No institutional background. Well, some experts say that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization can be a good, at least initial platform, a good jumping off place to further expand to embrace the Eurasian countries. But let's turn our eyes to what happened last February. India and Pakistan are the SCO members, and they were involved in a full-scale armed conflict last February, and they didn't discuss the presumable terrorist issue at under the auspices of the SCO. Instead, India acted unilaterally, and this is a revealing development in itself. And also no consolidating idea. In fact, colleagues, we are for everything good and against everything bad is not something on which a good project, a workable project can be premised. And here, this idea should be attractive to both China, India, Russia, and the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't seem to perform this task. For example, just imagine in case China asks Russia to express its political support to the Belt and Road Initiative, Russia will be placed in a very uncomfortable position, because by saying the political support to the Belt and Road Initiative, China will mean the political support for the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is strongly disapproved by India. And here, in order to make China pleased, Russia can do it, but its relations with India will be, I would say, very seriously deteriorated, while refusing to do it, this deterioration will be about the Russian-Chinese relations. And here, I do not see any really attractive and workable idea to cope with this task in order to consolidate the key Eurasian actors. The next slide, please. Okay, but speaking about China, nevertheless, a logical question comes to mind. Well, in case we agree with China's bid to make the Greater Eurasian Partnership Sino-centric, what about this scenario? I suppose this scenario is more discouraging rather than encouraging for at least 3 reasons. You remember, friends, that China didn't recognize, didn't accept the verdict of the permanent Court of Arbitration about the South China Sea issue. And now imagine the following scenario. Suppose the Belt and Road Initiative gains further momentum. And I suppose it goes without saying that numerous contradictions, disputes, and other forms of disagreement are likely to appear very quickly. And where to resolve these differences? The most obvious answer is to resolve them at the venues related to the international law, international legal platforms under the auspices of the United Nations, etc. And the international arbitration is logical to be the key instrument. But how China sees the international law was demonstrated during China's reaction to the South China, to the Permanent Court of Arbitration verdict on the South China Sea. We do not like this decision, so we do not recognize it, and this is our principal position. Okay, and in case China prioritizes its domestic law at the expense of the international law, the Belt and Road Initiative as a mega strategy may be, I would say, not as attractive as it initially was seen by China's neighbors. Okay, to put all the eggs just into China's basket, is it a good decision? Practice demonstrates that China may stumble, and the current pandemic is, or maybe just the beginning. It's unreasonable to rely upon one state, to rely upon China, because, too many factors should be taken into account, and practice has demonstrated that even China may stumble. Okay, and also, colleagues, another point that deserves special mentioning. China is trying to build its, I would say, Sino-centric security system based upon the Belt and Road Initiative. And as a Russian expert, I would raise a very simple question. Which place is Russia expected to occupy in this system? I suppose that China sees itself as the center, and the other states are seen as the periphery. And as China's policy in the South China Sea demonstrates, China can rely upon economic instruments so that to gain political benefits. And in my opinion, Chinese investment flows can be linked and synergized with China's demands on concessions on political issues. The next slide, please. Okay, and now let's turn to the specificity of the relations between Russia and Indonesia. And here, friends, very briefly, just the key points, because His Excellency has already outlined in his, I would say, comprehensive presentation, everything that should have been outlined. And 3 points. First, our relations, we may like or dislike it, have been developing inconsistently. They have been developing at jocks, there have been ups and downs, and this lack of consistency is a factor that should be taken into account. Also, these relations do not have, I would say, the grassroots foundation, the top-down I would say, top-down platform. You remember that initially the supply production chains led by Japan or South Korea within the factory Asia were developed, and later on institutions followed, and the institutions were built after the a dense network between, for example, companies, enterprises, individual businessmen were established and solidified. And this is not about Russia-Indonesia relations. Our relations have been built outside these supply production chains and outside the processes which link business actors, once again, enterprises, companies, production units, etc. And finally, these relations lacked a big idea because Russia's pivot to the Asia-Pacific region didn't and doesn't have a specific Indonesian dimension. And also Russia's pivot to the Asia-Pacific region is quickly becoming a pivot to the People's Republic of China at the expense of other partners. And as trade figures demonstrate, Russia's more active policy in the Asia-Pacific region, well, hasn't had, I would say, favorable after effects for trade between Russia and Indonesia. And once again, it hasn't been a specifically Indonesian-oriented undertaking. And also Indonesia in its turn I can say attaches more significance to building relations with China as part of synergizing the global maritime fulcrum strategy with the maritime Silk Road of the 21st century, and also with its immediate neighbors like Australia, India, but not Russia, and here the factor of distance matters. And this lack of big idea is a conspicuous development which shouldn't be ignored. The next slide, please. And raising the question about the instruments that can re-energize the cooperation between Russia and Indonesia, linking it with the Greater Eurasian Partnership. Is it a good option? Okay, I can say that this idea at the level of idea corresponds to the interests of both Russia and Indonesia. And seen from the Russian perspective, I would say that the Indonesian direction may allow Russia to diversify its policy and to make it more independent from China, because once again, to over-rely upon China is not a good option. Also, Indonesia has outlined ASEAN's vision on the Indo-Pacific region, and the ASEAN's position is not ideal. It has its weak points, but nevertheless, it was Indonesia that took on the initiative in developing this idea and in presenting it to the international community, and taking into consideration that the Indo-Pacific region is considered to be an unwelcoming development in Russia, Indonesia can be a good mediator or possibly, well, a good middleman in managing Russia's policy towards the Indo-Pacific region. At least Indonesia could be a partner whom Russia could trust in in speaking to the members of the Quadrilateral Defense Cooperation Group. And also Indonesia is a good example of how a country should develop relations with everybody who is ready to speak, who is open to dialogue, and who is ready to speak about cooperation. Indonesia has never been motivated by political factors, as far as I can judge, and Indonesia has always been very flexible in formulating its foreign policy priorities and in implementing its foreign policy. This is a good example to follow, and here, this is another strategic asset that could be used to Russia's greatest advantage. The next slide, please. Well, from the Indonesian perspective, resetting cooperation with Russia as part of the Greater Eurasian Partnership framework can also be attractive, because the Indonesian leadership sees its countries is Indonesia among the global actors. But being a global actor means being able to substantiate this bid, substantiate this vision by participating in global projects. And also, Indonesia is already participating in the Belt and Road Initiative, but to have a kind of diversification option would be in Indonesia's interests. And the Greater Eurasian Partnership is a project with the global potential, and by means of this, Indonesia can substantiate its global vision by global instruments. Also, the so-called second economy effect. You know, friends, in my opinion, this is an important prerequisite, an important thing in the present day international situation. And the second economy, by saying the second economy, I mean the following thing. Of course, you remember the supply protection chains of technologically advanced products created by Japan and South Korea in Southeast Asia, and I mean the new industrial economy. So the first wave and on the second of the second wave, and Japan created this second economy, which means an area of Japanese-friendly economic activity outside Japanese national borders. And when Japan's economy encountered difficult times in the 90s, it was the second economy that provided Japan with safety mechanisms to soften the economic blow, and Indonesia cannot but think about it and to have an option beyond the already existing options in developing your economic potential outside the national borders is also a good option. And finally, the Arctic fact matters. It may be a coincidence, but since recently I have been encountering more and more articles prepared by Indonesian scholars about the Arctic, because the rising sea level is seen by Indonesian intellectuals as a factor that may be detrimental to the national security, and as part of Indonesian efforts to substantiate its global status, to participate in the development of the Arctic may be a timely and a relevant step. And here Russia becomes a valuable partner to translate this task from vision into reality. The next slide, please. Okay, but what about the economic foundation of these plans? Here you see the bilateral trade figures between Russia and Indonesia, and I cannot say that these figures have been stagnating. They are rising. They have been rising since, well, the mid-90s, but in case we compare the Russia-Indonesian trade with the corresponding figures of other Russian and Indonesia's partners, these figures will pale in comparison. And the Great Eurasian Partnership, at least now, cannot offer Russia and Indonesia well, a good economic foundation to complement their efforts to develop cooperation. And this is once again more about idea rather than a fully fledged project which can be used, which can be elaborated on here and now. The next slide, please. Well, Indonesia and the Eurasian Economic Union have been moving towards the establishment of the FTA regime, and this direction hasn't been stagnating, it has been developing, and you see how that numerous events have taken place since May 2017. And this is a work in progress. But on the other hand, some factors should be taken into consideration. There is the indication the digital trade restrictions indication list, and Russia and Indonesia unfortunately occupy the top 5 positions within this list, and it goes without saying that at present the digital part of international trade is raising in significance, and in the present day coronavirus pandemic its significance is further rising. And also, you cannot, put me right if I am mistaken, but you cannot develop a successful free trade regime in case you are under international sanctions. And here I would have to repeat what Mikhail Kuritsyn told us this morning, that the American factor matters a lot. The United States does not openly discourage, doesn't say you shouldn't cooperate with the Russians. It creates the international milieu in and around Indonesia, in which to cooperate with Russia is not profitable, and here businesses see this situation very clearly. The next slide, please. And here, friends, you see in terms of the free trade area between the Eurasian Economic Union and ASEAN as possibly the final destination of efforts to develop trade between Russia and Indonesia. The figures are rising, but this rise cannot be referred to as I would say a qualitative change. In my opinion, it's too early to speak meaningfully about the development or the maturing or the down top vector of down top foundations of relations, and moving it to the next moving these relations to the next stage to institutionalize them. And the next slide, please. Okay, friends, and to summarize the key points of my presentation, let me tell you this. So far, Russia and Indonesia has been adopting the minimum sufficiency approach, and neither country has the motivation to further expand these relations. Once again, in order to export more from Russia, for example, industrial goods, Indonesia has to completely revise its industrial policy. And I do not see any reasons for Indonesia to be ready and to be willing to undertake this revision just because Indonesia doesn't need it. And Indonesia has other partners to cooperate, and also Russia seems to be more and more inclining to China as the key Asia-Pacific partner. And once again, we can lament a lot about insufficient trade figures between Russia and the United States and Russia and Indonesia, but the fact remains that two radical shifts, economic shifts, industrial shifts, mentality shifts are necessary in order to translate this vision into reality, and even modest results are not very likely. The second point stands for this. The Greater Eurasian Partnership is not a ready instrument that can be implemented in the here and now format in order to re-energize the presently stagnating relations between Russia and Indonesia. And this is about, I would say, future perspectives, about the ideal vision directed to the future, rather than about workable instruments that can prove their efficiency in the next several years. But here we have a logical question. Is it necessary to raise our relations to elevate our relations to the level of strategic partnership? In my opinion, the answer is positive. The strategic partnership is a welcoming step because if you do not want to do, you should make a step forward. If you do not want what to do, you should move beyond the presently existing framework of cooperation. As a well-known political figure, Dwight Eisenhower, put it, if the problem cannot be resolved, enlarge it. And the strategic partnership is part of this enlargement. And by means of this, once again, I have to repeat, this is a welcoming development. My dear colleagues, thank you very much. And I am ready to and delightful to answer your questions. Well, your questions, please, Your Excellency. I suppose you will be the first to speak.
Thank you very much. I think that's very comprehensive analysis about our relations. I noted here why I mentioned several times, with Russia becoming the 12th biggest economy, Indonesia 16th biggest economy, but look at the trade is very minimum. At least there are two. One is the tyranny of distance. We are far away, and each of has a priority in terms of its foreign policy. Like us, for example, our first ring of foreign policy is, of course, Asia, and then ASEAN +3, and then APEC, and so on. And yours, like, of course, the sea ice country, and then Euro-Asian, and so on. So it's a matter of different priorities. I think it makes sense. And number two is the problem of image. As I mentioned in my previous presentation in the morning, especially during the New Order government, the image of Russia is not very, positive. Yeah. That's why my first program, and even before I came to Russia, is how to encourage more people-to-people contact, because once people coming, they can tell, seeing is believing, they can tell themselves, and they can look at the potential that they can work together. And I think in a way it has been very successful. You look at the number of tourists from both sides, like Russian, when I came here on the 80,000, now close to 160,000. The Indonesian is growing very much faster, despite the fact it was only 5,000, and then now about 30,000, means 6 times. In trade, although it's not quite discouraging, when the fact that there's a decrease in the volume, but compared to other ASEAN countries, not that bad. That's why I'm very much keen to push the signing of FTA. And unfortunately, of course, because of the coronavirus, the first round of negotiation cannot materialize today. So this is, I think, what would like to contribute to our relations after spending more than 4 years believing end of this month. So this might be my last seminar on Russia-Indonesia relations. And but I see there is more awareness on both sides. If you look at the numbers of parliaments, almost every month, last year we always have member of parliaments visiting Russia, a member on the high levels, ranks in military personnel, and also encouraging also the number of universities visiting Russia and trying to sign MOU. There are so many agreements already been made between Russian and Indonesian universities. So this is just a beginning, because both countries have the same weakness. We are not good in selling our country. there's like image deficit for us. Quoting my foreign minister term, like trust deficit for us is actually image. I jokingly tell my friend in Russia, for example, every year we import maybe dozens of Hollywood movies, and we have only one from Russia, Marsha and the Bear. How could you compete with American? But the film was well received in Indonesia, but we only one. So I think I would like to congratulate High School of Economics and the Russian Science for organizing this seminar. I think this might be the most comprehensive conference and seminar on Indonesia. So I would like to.
Your Excellency, we have one more speaker and then a discussion.
Okay.
We are not going to complete our our discussion now. Well, and
thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, friends, as the moderator of our discussion, I would like to ask our two participants, Mikhail Vyacheslamovich and Alexander Vyacheslamovich. Suppose an FTA between Russia and Indonesia is concluded tomorrow. Will it radically change the situation? And no, I know that we are turning into fantasies, but let's try to do it. Stemming from the present day realities.
If I may try to answer your question, Evgeny. Probably increase of bilateral turnover by 5 to 10%. That's what we can immediately expect from signing of the free trade agreement. But medium long term, definitely it will create additional opportunities, additional mutual attention, and definitely it will contribute to the increase of bilateral trade and economic cooperation. But at the same time, I would put another example. The low level of bilateral trade and investment, definitely it is a very poor achievement, which reflects certain historical obstacles in development of economic relations. But at the same time, this is amazing opportunity. We have so low level of trade, we have so low level of investment. That's just couple of good projects, and we will be so impressed by getting bilateral trade doubled within 3 years and getting bilateral investment increased 10 times within 3 to 5 years. Just one example. Indonesia has tremendous problem of power generation, the shortage of new capacity of power to be introduced every year. One of the obstacles is not so much the lack of funding, lack of technologies available, but basically non-existence of cheap raw material. Indonesia requires natural gas as one of the main source of power to replace oil and to a certain extent if not to replace it, at least to support coal. Supply of Russian LNG to Indonesia, and it should be happening now when the gas price is so low, when Russia itself has difficulty in selling gas to Europe and to China. Both markets are overloaded, prices going down. This is opportunity for Indonesia to get comparatively low-cost LNG from Russia. This is opportunity for Novatek, for Gazprom to enter Indonesia. This is opportunity to Russian producers of power generation equipment to introduce Russian projects with Russian equipment in Indonesian power sector. Related to gas, to put just one fertilizer factory in gas pipeline, which goes either to Black Sea or goes to Vladivostok Nakhodka, with Indonesian involvement and commitment to supply exclusively to Indonesia, let's say 20, 30, 50% of the fertilizer to be produced. Indonesia has tremendous shortage of fertilizer. The fertility of land goes down, population goes up. There is discrepancy, and the food supply is one of the essential matters of Indonesian economic security. And again, Russian gas transferred into fertilizer to be supplied to Pupuk, Indonesia, then mixed with other fertilizers from different sources, and then it will give additional boost to Indonesian agriculture, from palm oil to rice, from coffee to tea, rubber, and other sectors. This is in economic field. Just one project, purchase of Indonesian palm oil being swapped with Russian military equipment, first of all by Sukhoi. We will have double the Indonesian export of plantation commodities to Russia, and we will have absolutely different state of Indonesian armed forces in accordance with the national plan of Indonesia, which was lately introduced. Just a couple of projects, and we will have absolutely different story, and then we may call it strategic partnership, because it will contribute to independence of both countries from the weaknesses or shortages which they experience right now. Now, I can give many other examples, but I know that we're limited in time. That's why just this example, and the life will be different. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alexander Vyacheslavic. Would you like to add something?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I should say that I cannot completely agree with His Excellency, who said that the distance between two countries is a big obstacles in our relations. Frankly speaking, I was trading with Indonesia for many years, and certainly it would be much better to have Indonesia more near to Russia. But frankly speaking, the transport logistic has been already arranged between our two countries, and it's not problem at all to export goods from Indonesia to Russia and vice versa. And I also cannot agree completely with my friend and partner Michael Kuritson, who earlier said that there is a big impact of American sanctions on Russian-Indonesian trade relations in civilian fields. Because I strongly believe that if businessmen from both sides could see that some deal is beneficial for them, they will ignore any threats or any preconditions from American side. And quite oftenly I can meet with businessmen from Indonesia who are coming to Moscow from East Java, from West Java, from West Sumatra, and everybody is seeking for having relations with Russia. So it's not a big problem. And certainly, I do not believe that just the signing of the agreement of strategic partnership will automatically increase our economic relations. I think that it should be strong efforts from both sides to fill this partnership with real deals. And just about the increasing our trade volume, there is just one small thing which could be done. Indonesia, just to reach this target, which was defined by our presidents of, for example, 5 billion. Indonesia just should begin to import oil products from Russia. Yes, and even with low prices of nowadays for oil and oil products, this target will be reached very rapidly, because as we know, every day Indonesia should buy around 800,000 barrels of oil and oil products to fulfill its requirements in these commodities. And that is why we very much hope that the strategic project in Tuban between Pertamina and Rosneft will be continued successfully. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, colleagues, it's time we give the floor to Alina Vladimirova, and she will be speaking about the trade relations between Russia and Indonesia as a follow-up presentation to what has already been said. And I suppose that she will both specify and correct some points that have already been raised. Alina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to take part in this extremely interesting roundtable, sorry. So first I probably switch to my presentation. I know that I'm the last, so I will try to like a little bit cut like general wording and general introductions, and to connect to other speakers, because there is a lot of connections, and at some point I was even glad that my presentation is actually the last one. So it's what exactly about international trade. I would agree with Alexander Popov that just the signing of FTA or preferential trade agreement, and the history already shown it and proved it like many times, that just the signing of agreement doesn't mean that there is going to be a huge rise in volume of trade. So we really need to find some opportunities, and many other speakers today also was telling that how Russia can contribute to what's going on in Indonesia, what are the mutual interests. And as analytics scholar, I suppose we are the people who can introduce some ideas and insights to people who doing this in practice, even so some of the models can be not quite correct, but I really was trying to put my analysis to new opportunities and new challenges that we have. It also was saying today that the world is changing, not just about viruses, but also there is other threats. And as we know, recently the world leading by United Nations set the new agenda, which is called Sustainable Development Agenda. So I'm prefer today to skip the whole evolution of this agenda in the world in Indonesia. Just for people who are interested, I would say that there is quite interesting situation, because while Russia in the beginning of the 90s was full hands with falling and drop of Soviet Union, you already can see some papers and quite interesting publication on development and sustainable development by Indonesian politicians and Indonesian authors. And there is also their own stars like Emil Salim. So it's really interesting topic, but I suppose more or less all the people here are aware what is sustainable development. And so basically we have poverty, we have environment, and so we have cooperation, and we have some economic issues. But basically there is 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic, society, and environment. So when we talk about Indonesia, it's quite interesting discourse, to say the truth, which can be found in international press and in Indonesian press, because a lot of people all around the world doesn't really take seriously and take Indonesia importance in terms of sustainable development and climate change as much as should be. And here is some headings from like international media, from Indonesian media, and even from the like scientific, like leading university, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is also showing that there is not enough attention put to what importance Indonesia has for us in terms of sustainable development. There is also some like good points and some bad points, so we can actually can see quite often a fact that Indonesia is among top 5 countries that are like the hugest countries that emits greenhouse gases. But on the other hand, and which I also like about this topic and about our Russian colleagues, we started a new discussion that this sustainable development agenda can be actually risky for the countries who are just now developing. And the issue is that the countries who already developed and pass this sometimes away with a lot of mistakes and missions and so on and so on and so on. And now they're saying that we stop to cut this way of development and looking at the countries that are actually now trying to solve their problems by developing. And they say, okay, you should cut your development, and there is really like unfair rules of game. And among these studies, which is very interesting, Indonesia is present almost always like one of these countries that is at risk in terms of being like victim on these new rules. And Russia can be one of these countries that can support the new understanding of role of Indonesia for this sustainable development age. And of course, we need to find some opportunities for booster our cooperation. It's not just signing or not political will, because political will was there for decades, but we can't really see the good results. So we really can try to get from these challenges to new opportunities. And one of the important issue is, of course, trade. And today trade was mentioned many times, because it's in terms of power, in terms of wealth, in terms of development, trade extremely important. That's why there is a bunch of indicators, and luckily we have data, which we can use for our analysis to understand what is going on. So Professor Kanaev, in his previous speech, has already mentioned like a general framework. So I'm also going to skip it now and to use my presentation just like a small case study, how we can analyze our trade flows and try to find new opportunities for us. Because if there is already a supply chain, and we know that for East and Southeast Asia, these supply chains are already formed and quite stable, so it's difficult to get with a new idea inside this chain. It's impossible. But for example, these new types of goods, it was said about digital, but there is also environmental goods, and this topic started to rise recently. And considering the new agenda, it could be quite an interesting stuff. So I decided today to show the small piece of research. So out of the trade data, which is collected by the United Nations, I took all of these like 4 categories for trade and put them to like quantitative analysis. So basically here we can see export and import of Russia in Indonesia. And we can see that basically environmental goods in export almost not present, and in import it's present, not much, but still if we look more precisely to the structure of export import in terms of focusing on environmental goods, we will see quite an interesting picture, which is like more similar for Russia and for Indonesia. Here is the same scale, so just for you to put attention, in the next picture I change scales for each of this type of goods for each own scale, so the picture looks a little bit different. But what we can see here, which could be interesting for us in terms of our cooperation, so we can see that there is actually a market of the environmental goods, and there is a demand in Indonesia and demand in Russia in this type of goods, on different of monitoring goods, of protection goods, on renewable goods, and so on and so on. Both of our countries has actually some potential to export this type of goods, but for now we can see that it's actually a niche and a free market, which both countries can try to set for our countries. Of course, when we talk about trade, just to take this type of analysis, it's not enough, because basically trade is a network. So network analysis, it's much more suitable for the modern globalized trade. And in this picture, I use it quite often in my presentations. It's just like general trade in Asia-Pacific, with focus again on ASEAN. And we can see that it's run by China. There is supply chains by Japan, by Rockets Republic of Korea. So there is little that these countries of ASEAN, including Indonesia, can do in terms of finding new markets and to create new supply chains. So, but if we look at these pictures, but switch to again, at least, let it be for environmental monitoring goods. I changed the yellow color to gray color just for it to be more better for the visual analysis. So we can see that the picture is completely different. So here we can see major players who already set it, the market, and so the rules of this game is already actually settled. But when we're talking about environmental goods, the situation is completely different. So it's opportunity for both of our countries to cooperate. And if we look specifically of Russia and Indonesia, so export and import this network looks of course different, but still we can see that there is no huge players. So this markets, as the previous slide shows, that there is a demand, and there is no huge players who already organized supply chains. So there is really could be some opportunities for cooperation. But of course, we need to take into consideration many different aspects, including our treaties and what is possible, not possible to trade, because gas looks on one hand is a nice opportunity, but on the other hand, near Indonesia there is Australia, so the situation even with gas, it's quite complicated. And basically, building such a type of analysis, we then can implement some even general basic formulas to calculate, for example, centralities, and then to understand what perspective for cooperation, because here is degree centrality, it could be show us how active we should be on this market, but there is also closeness centrality in terms of power, in terms of opportunity to influence market. It's basically shows how the country can be controlled by other countries in terms of supplies. So there was sanctions. So closeness centrality is one of these indicators that can be calculated to understand how vulnerable the country in terms of well, not only sanctions, it could be natural disasters like was in Fukushima in Japan when the supply chain just stopped. So closeness centrality can be used for this type of analysis. And betweenness centrality, for example, for Russia, betweenness centrality is extremely important indicator because it shows like mediator role. So sometimes you don't need to be connected to many countries. You just need to take some good position which connect other countries between each other. So, and for Indonesia, who has opportunity to go to different market, slightly different markets than Russia, actually also because of this territorial physical distance, yeah. So this between us centrality also can give us some opportunities to show the ways for development. And of course we can see the trends using this networks analysis and to find what is going on. And here is like, for example, degree centrality, how active countries of ASEAN during this time, how they are rising their activity, not just country by country, but in the whole system of international trade. So we can see that Indonesia also needs some new ways to rise and to support its growth. So in Russia can find some interesting ways to do so. So basically, just to be short, that's what I actually wanted to say today. So if you have any questions, I would be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, Alina, thank you so much. Now let's open our Q&A session with relevance to the last PowerPoint. Well, are there any comments, remarks, suggestions, questions? Well, in this case, let's open our final discussion, and in order to make it possibly active, lively, and result-oriented, let me tell you this. Russia and Indonesia are both influential, without any exaggeration, global powers, because Indonesia is the largest Muslim state in terms of its population and a very influential state in the global Muslim community. And also Indonesia, since recently, has been involved in the implementation of global projects, and the Indonesian elite, as I have already mentioned, sees its country among the global leaders, and this finds resonance in Russia. Also, Indonesia and Russia are countries dependent upon infrastructure. For both Russia and Indonesia, the construction of infrastructure as part of its or the instruments to achieve and maintain sustainable development, once again, for both countries, infrastructure plays a very important role. Also, both Russia and Indonesia are multi-confessional and multi-ethnic countries, and this fact makes both countries to develop democratic institutions and to find ways to maintain and solidify social harmony. And finally, the political will at the top level exists to maintain close and result-oriented cooperation. And here I have a very simple question, which goes to all the participants of our discussion. How could it have happened that these very important factors haven't exerted much influence and haven't significantly contributed to real, not declaratory, but real results in making the Russian-Indonesian cooperation, I would say, what exactly the name of the strategic partnership suggests: to make our countries strategic partners with strategic tasks and possibilities to translate this kind of relations from vision into reality. His Excellency has told us, as well as Mikhail Vyacheslamovich, these speakers have told us that Russia and Indonesia do have strategic tasks in cooperation with each other. And there are some important factors that make this cooperation really strategic, as its name suggests. I mean, the strategic partnership. And considering that the political will exists and hopefully will increase, once again, colleagues, how could it have happened that these relations, well, haven't been close to what they really deserve? Who wants to speak?
Okay. Thank you very much. My answer is simple. Again, as I mentioned several times, there is ignorance on both sides of our potentials. Maybe because of the distance and so on. Yeah, but I see there is a light in the end of tunnel. Just to comment the last speaker, for example, despite the declining of number of trade, but some products a very positive signing of increasing quite significantly. For example, in the area of palm oil, we decreased or declined by 5%, but some of our products like footwear, they increased by 37%, and then stainless steel 279%, and also other products like, for example, I may not believe it, but this is the first time that today Russia imported ship boats. This is for special forces in Russia, and it was built in East Java. So there are always some potential that we have to push ahead. And I think apart from strategic partnership designing, of course, because this is the main foundation of our relations, the sooner we sign the FTA between Indonesia and Eurasian Economic Union is the better. As we had with other countries who signed this agreement and started partnership as well as the FTA, the trend is quite encouraging. So I think that's the answer to what we have discussed today. And lastly, I would like to extend my appreciation to the host, the High School of Economics and the Institute of Oriental Studies for organizing this. I think this might be the biggest, the most comprehensive and the longest conference that I ever follow. So for this, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Well, who else wants to speak? In case there are no more comments, or Mikhail Vyacheslamovich.
Just very short. Basically, there are not so many of us remain visible in the audience. Very short. First of all, why we have what we have? Definitely, it's a result of the history of bilateral relations, and from this point of view, I think it's reminds all of us how important is responsibility of decision makers, responsibility of each of us being involved in the facilitation of different aspects of bilateral relations, and how fragile this network is. Just a couple of wrongdoings, irresponsibilities, not counting the consequences, not overestimating or underestimating certain aspects, and for a couple of generations, we can have a gap in a relationship between two great countries, two great nations, and basically what we are discussing right now is how to build the bridge overcoming this deep gap which was created in second half of 60s and 70s. And unfortunately, again, two of our nations were very much dependent on the third countries factor. In case of 1965, 1966, in bilateral relations, it was the factor of domino theory of United States and Chinese Communist Party concept of the, let's say, how the world should be organized. And we are now actually trying to overcome this. This is one point. Regarding the results of our today's discussion, I think it's, for me, I was very much impressed by the last presentation. First of all, Alina, thank you for your approach. I don't know how to, for me, as a practical person with scientific background, I don't know how to use it as an instrument in order to give additional boost to concrete projects, to concrete trends, to concrete door opening opportunities. But in any case, basically I came from Institute of Oriental Studies, where I had the privilege of having my postgraduate studies in the beginning of 80s. I'm very much impressed that young generation of smart and beautiful people, they have, first of all, they like the subject, they're interested in Indonesia, they're interested in Southeast Asia, and it gives all of us, the, let's say, elder generation team, feeling that there is a potential, there is a future of our relationship, there is definitely good prospects, and knowing that my own kids and Alexander Popov, his kids, they're studying Oriental languages, they're studying Indonesia, they're so much impressed by Indonesian culture and so much interested to do something independently, whether it is culture, business, politics, diplomacy, but to do something for bilateral development of bilateral relations. We have a chance. Our relations has a future, and definitely I appreciate the effort of two institutions, High School of Economics and actually not two institutions, many institutions, but under the leadership of High School of Economics and Institute of Oriental Studies and Institute of Asian and African Studies to make it happen. I would like also to use this opportunity to mention one name, Professor Ogloblin from St. Petersburg University. He passed away last month. It's a big loss for all of us. There is a very strong school created by him in second largest city of Russia, and as we call it, cultural capital of Russia, St. Petersburg. And we hope that this discussion could be also shared with our colleagues from other places in Russia and other institutions in Indonesia. And let's try to make this format more widely used, more frequently used on different topics. Definitely 70 years of diplomatic relations will let's say, will eventually pass, but there are so many other aspects of bilateral relations which worth talking about, and not only political, not only economic. I also would like to remind that we have Russia-Indonesia Friendship Society, and we have Nusantara, the place where we have exchange of scientific and non-scientific, basically, relations between those people who are being affected by Indonesian, Malaysian, Nusantara Southeast Asian culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander Vячеславович.
Thank you very much. And speaking about strategic partnership, I once again should disagree with His Excellency about the distance. In this case, I think distance is not such a big problem, especially in our relations. And I strongly believe that if we speak about strategic partnership, this concept must suppose that each strategic partner should assist to each other, especially in difficult situations. And in this case, I should remind to everybody that when tsunami happened in Indonesia, Russian specialists came to Indonesia to help to overcome this situation. When forest firing and the crashing of Air Asia airplane happened in Indonesia, Russian specialists and Beriev 200 came to Indonesia to help. And there are many other manifestations of Russians' assistance in difficult situations to Indonesia. And I strongly believe that Russia will continue to help Indonesia in any possibility. And I also should remind that right now Russia faces her own difficulty concerning these, regarding these American sanctions in military purchases field. And that is why I believe that if we speak about strategic partnership, we also should be waiting for the certain actions from Indonesian side in this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander Vячеславович. Okay, colleagues, who else wants to make some points? Okay, and now as the moderator of our discussion, let me briefly summarize its main results. Today, we have had a wonderful day. We have traced the specificity of the Russian-Indonesian relations from their historical perspective. We have tried to analyze what is behind the present day, well, in some respects, not satisfactory results in relations between Russia and Indonesia, and how to make them what their forthcoming name suggests, their strategic partnership. We have tried to understand which specific directions, measures, and mechanisms are most appropriate to re-energize these relations. But most importantly, we have had a good example of how academic diplomacy should be developed. And here I suggest we should stop here and at this specific point, and let me once again remind you that the Institute of Oriental Studies and the Higher School of Economics are preparing a collective monograph in which the key results of today's discussion will be summarized and presented, and our discussion is a work in progress. Okay, colleagues and friends, thank you so much, and hope to see you later.